The federal government is putting in place new measures today to help stop the spread of COVID-19, and they announced that air passengers can now only enter Canada after getting a negative result from a COVID test. The Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc, made the announcement earlier today.
I can announce that Canada will quickly implement the requirement for all arriving passengers to have a negative PCR COVID test 3 days before arriving in Canada.
We believe that that will assist us in potentially identifying some individuals who may be at risk. And I hope people will understand that it's in addition to the quarantine requirement, not a replacement for that.
We'll hear more from Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc in just a few minutes. He'll join us right here live to try to dig into the questions that we don't have answers to yet. But first, I want to bring in the CBC's Catherine Tunney. So, Catherine, I'm going to get you to dig in a little bit. There's still a lot of unanswered questions, but tell us more of what was announced today.
Well, Hannah, if you're someone who has not thought about international travel in months, this announcement probably does not impact you. But if you are thinking of traveling, or if you are tuning in and you are abroad, you should know there are changes coming. So as you said, the federal government is now going to require air travelers to prove that they've tested negative for COVID-19 before landing in Canada. And that announcement came this morning after a cabinet meeting. So essentially, air travelers will need to get what's known as a PCR test that is negative within 3 days, so 72 hours before landing in Canada. Now, PCR tests, I think at this point, most Canadians are quite familiar with the image of getting a swab up your nose. You'll have to get that kind of test before you're allowed back in the country. Now, to be clear, this does not replace the mandatory quarantine period, that 14-day period that people who return to Canada, need to stay inside. And if you break that quarantine, you risk fines and jail time. That is still in place. This does not replace that. It's just a new extra measure that is coming soon. And also, to be very clear, the minister stressed that they are still saying don't travel if you don't have to. This is just, as I said, an added measure that could be coming soon.
So you say soon. Any idea when it's going to come into effect?
Well, Hannah, I think you can write a big TBD down next to that question. A lot of the nitty-gritty is still to be determined. Minister LeBlanc did say that more details are coming soon, but they would like to have this in place soon. He did say at one point, though, that if he was on a Caribbean beach, he would look up what are some nearby clinics to see if he can find a PCR test. Of course, that might perhaps be a dig at Ontario's finance minister, who, of course, is in trouble today. But it is a very valid question for people who are abroad right now trying to figure out, when do I need to go get this test? When will this come in effect? Other questions are like, what if you are in a country where you can't get a PCR test or it's incredibly hard? So we're still waiting for a lot of those details. We are told they're going to come soon. And of course, you have the minister coming up, so maybe you can get us those answers. So yeah, a lot of question marks. But what was very clear from this morning's announcement is that something is coming and something is coming soon.
Okay, Catherine, thank you so much for the update. Yes, we are going to ask the minister a lot of those questions coming up right now. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
Okay, so for more on this, I'm joined by Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc. There he is. See, I'll spit it out, Minister, eventually. Dominic LeBlanc.
Hey, Hannah, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. Happy holidays. Yeah, same to you. So let's get to some of that nitty gritty, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to know some of the answers to those questions. When is it going to be implemented?
My colleague, Hannah, Mark Garneau, the Transport Minister, will have more details tomorrow. We expect the requirement for a negative COVID test, at least within 72 hours of arriving in Canada. We expect that to be in place within a week. But Mark Garneau obviously is in discussions with the airlines and others, because they will have the responsibility to do the screening at the point of departure before the flight back to Canada. Those tests will be required before boarding a plane to return to Canada. But they'll be in place within a week, and Mark Garneau will have all those details by this time tomorrow.
Okay, so we will ask him tomorrow, but I'm going to continue to pick your brain on it because you seem to know a little bit about it still. Will the government be offering those PCR tests at consuls or hotels or airports abroad so that Canadians can get this test, or will it be totally up to the traveler?
Well, first of all, Hannah, we have been advising since March Canadians not to undertake non-essential travel. So somebody who's decided to go spend Christmas on a beach in the Caribbean doesn't feel to me like an essential travel requirement. So they've already decided to ignore the clear advice of public health authorities, federal and provincial, for many months. And now they will be required to procure the negative COVID test themselves. The Government of Canada obviously is not in a position to set up at hotels or all-inclusive resorts or Canadian consulates. Those tests are available at these international destinations. And somebody who's not able to get that test in time for their return flight to Canada, for example, next week, will be required to quarantine at a federally approved site at the point of arrival until they have a negative PCR test and until the Canadian authorities are satisfied that their 14-day quarantine plan is adequate. So nothing about this restricts or limits the legal obligation, with very severe consequences to people who ignore it. Nothing limits the obligation to have an effective 14-day quarantine plan upon your return to Canada. But this is one of a bunch of measures, Hannah, that we wanted to put in place, frankly, to show Canadians that their common sense and their adherence to public health advice is important to protect everybody.
Okay, let me just try to clarify that because I just don't understand. So if someone cannot procure one of those tests next week, they can still return home on their flight, but they must go into a federally regulated quarantine site for 14 days when they return home.
Well, those are the details that Mark Garneau will fill in tomorrow. They will be required to stay at a federally approved quarantine site at the point of arrival in Canada until such a time as that a negative test is obtained. It may take 2, 3, 4 days. And then they will have to follow an approved quarantine plan. And again, authorities will be, as a matter of secondary screening now, reviewing carefully the quarantine plans that people have when they come to Canada to ensure that they meet the public health requirements. And anybody, this is already in place now, Hannah, and has been in place since March. Anybody who arrives from an international destination with a quarantine plan that's judged to be inadequate, then they are referred to a federally mandated quarantine site. So those measures will continue.
Then let me just play a little bit of devil's advocate here. If people are stressed down south right now and don't want to go try to find one of these PCR tests, wouldn't they just return on their flight and then go to those the federal quarantine sites?
Well, again, that would be irresponsible in the sense that they will have, and as I said, Mark Garneau will have these details tomorrow, but they will have an obligation to arrive at the airport for their flight to Canada with a negative COVID test. Now, if they choose to once again ignore the advice and not bother to get a negative test or try and get a negative test at the destination where they are now, I think it speaks to their judgment if they willfully again ignore the public health advice. But when they do arrive in Canada, the quarantine measures applied by Canadian Border Services and Public Health Agency of Canada will follow the strict federal guidelines at a federally approved quarantine site. And Hannah, that's at your point of arrival. So if you arrive on a flight in Toronto or Montreal, you don't just quickly pick up your connecting flight to Halifax. You will be required to stay at your point of arrival at a federally approved site until the authorities are satisfied you have that negative test.
Will that person have to pay for that hotel when they arrive back?
All of those arrangements, Hannah, will be worked out by Mark Garneau tomorrow. But I think the fundamental thing is that we have had since March a very effective regime to prevent the spread of COVID-19 from international travelers. Less than 2% of all the cases in Canada have been linked to international travel. That's because international travel is down by over 90%. But as we've seen recently, some people have decided to ignore that public health advice and take holidays outside Canada. And when they return to Canada, they will be subject to very severe quarantine measures, but also very severe consequences if they willfully or deliberately decide not to follow the law, which requires this severe quarantine.
Okay. I want to ask you about the Calgary airport currently has a testing pilot program. That program allows Canadians the option of getting a test when they arrive back home, self-isolate for up to 48 hours to wait for the results. If the test is negative, they can leave quarantine. Will that be affected by these new rules?
No, that quarantine, that pilot project is based on a partnership with the government of Alberta, with public health authorities, Public Health Authority of Canada, specifically to get reliable evidence in terms of incoming international passengers. That pilot has been in place for a number of months. Other provincial governments have talked to us about trying to replicate arrival tests at airports for international travelers arriving back in Canada. But for the moment, there is absolutely no intention to shorten the quarantine period required. We're working with the government of Ontario and the government of Quebec around potential testing at airports in Montreal or Toronto. But as I said, for the moment, we don't have enough reliable scientific evidence to determine that a shortened quarantine period is in the interest of protecting the health of Canadians.
Why did the federal government only bring this up now, introduce this now? What was the holdup? Because, really, people are going to travel over the Christmas holiday.
Well, there wasn't really a holdup, Hannah. What we have said from the beginning, as countries around the world grapple with what is the pandemic of COVID-19, it's certainly territory that no country had faced in 100 years. So we have said from the beginning that we would adjust the measures based on what is in the best interest of protecting the health of Canadians. We would work with provinces and territories, as we have done, to ensure that they have, for example, access to vaccines, all of the medical equipment that we have shipped to provinces and territories. So this is simply the continuation of our government's effort to enhance and improve measures to protect the health of Canadians. You're going to see, for example, more security officials going to do in-person checks for those under a quarantine order because they've returned from Canada. So we're going to increase the enforcement of quarantine orders, simply to send a strong message, I think, Hannah, that Canadians expect us to send, that adherence to these measures, and in the case of a quarantine order, it's the law, adherence to these measures is in the public health interests of Canadians. And we're going to take every step necessary to ensure that this public health best practice is followed.
Minister LeBlanc, let me ask you this. You sound a bit frustrated that people are out there traveling after health officials have said don't do it, non-essential travel, but governments have done it. But we still continue to see it. We've seen it firsthand with the Ontario Finance Minister and Liberal MP MNA Pierre Arcan and others. What's your message to them? Don't you think they're supposed to be setting the example for the rest of Canadians?
Well, Hannah, of course they are. And our message has been consistent since the month of March, that non-essential travel needs to be avoided. You need to minimize your contacts. And if you're trying to minimize your contacts, going to some resort in another country or a beach party for New Year's Eve doesn't strike me like you're trying to limit your contacts. So
does that frustrate you? You're seeing people like the Ontario Finance Minister just flouting this advice? Well,
Hannah, people are responsible for their own decisions. My responsibility and our government's responsibility is to ensure that all of the most effective measures are in place to protect Canadians, to limit and contain the spread of COVID-19. The government of Canada has been very rigorous and very effective at ensuring that our borders are not the source in any significant way at all of the spread of COVID-19. And we're constantly reviewing measures that can be put in place to improve or to add another layer of effective containment of COVID-19. So this is simply the progression of something that we've been working on since the beginning of the pandemic. But we hope it's also a reminder to Canadians that if they want to protect their communities and their loved ones and people who are very vulnerable, for example, in long-term care homes, the best way to do that is to follow the public health advice.
Okay, I'm going to have to end it there. I would have loved to continue on. We did get some more answers from you. Dominic LeBlanc, thank you for your time and Happy New Year to you and your family.
Well, the same to you, Hannah. Thanks very much for having me on your program.
Okay, Dominic LeBlanc, of course, is the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.